Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. When a nurse doesn't come home, people worry. But when her car's still running, her purse is gone, and her body shows up in a trench coat in a muddy field, that's not a worry. That's murder. It took 23 years, one mysterious ring, and DNA science that didn't exist back then to crack the silence wide open. April 24th, 2000, Burton, Michigan. At 6:32 a.m., a local jogger called in a vehicle that had been idling near the mail drop on Hemphill Road for hours. The engine was still on. The windows rolled down. The driver's seat was empty. The car was a Chevrolet Cavalier, registered to a 32-year-old woman named Danyese LaClair. She was a nurse working the late shift at McLaren Regional Medical Center, and according to her time card, she clocked out the night before at 11:38 p.m. There had been no report of car trouble. No sign of forced entry. But inside the vehicle, something was wrong. Her purse was missing. Her pager had been turned off. The driver's seat was adjusted forward, consistent with her height. The keys were still in the ignition. No blood, no broken glass, no struggle. Deputy Michael Blaine was first to respond. In his report, no visible signs of foul play at the vehicle. No personal effects beyond a hospital ID lanyard on the passenger seat. Ignition still hot. What caught attention immediately was what wasn't there. Danyese. A be on the lookout was issued by 7:20 a.m. to all area units. A missing adult female, white, approximately 5'5", last seen wearing hospital scrubs. Initial assumptions range from abduction to voluntary disappearance, but without clear indicators, the case didn't immediately trigger state-level response. By 8:10 a.m., her husband, Dan LaClair, had been contacted. He was at home with their two children. He said he'd fallen asleep waiting for her to return. She never walked through the door. That morning, law enforcement began canvassing. A neighbor near the post office recalled seeing the vehicle just before midnight, parked with headlights on. Another said they thought it was a shift worker catching a nap. No one saw her leave. No one heard a struggle. At 10:43 a.m., a Department of Public Works worker assigned to drainage maintenance made a disturbing discovery. A body lying in waist-high brush on the edge of a private lot, less than 2 miles from where the vehicle had been left. The body was face up, partially obscured by a discarded tire and sheet metal. The deceased female matched the description of Danyese LaClair. She was found wearing only a light trench coat and undergarments. No shoes, no jewelry. There were no visible lacerations, just a single entry wound in the forehead, point blank. The medical examiner was called. Time of death was placed between 12:15 a.m. and 1:01 a.m. Forensics flagged the execution-style shot immediately. The trajectory was downward, indicating the shooter stood over her. Powder residue was recovered from the wound edges, confirming close-range discharge. Initial scene processing recovered one shell casing, 9mm unmarked. There were no drag marks on the ground. No tire impressions leading directly to the body. There were, however, faint footprints, inconsistent in spacing and depth, possibly indicating someone walked her to that spot or returned alone. And then there was the ring. Found 3 feet from the body, lying atop flattened brush, was a gold band, slightly worn, no visible inscription. Forensics confirmed it did not belong to the victim. Family stated she never owned or wore anything matching the description. This ring would remain in evidence storage, untested and unlinked, for over 2 decades. At this stage in 2000, Burton PD followed standard protocol: next of kin interviews, crime scene cordon, autopsy scheduling. No immediate suspects, no witnesses, no motive, no sign of sexual assault. Just one clean, quiet kill. And that was the problem. The autopsy returned with findings that further confirmed the profile. No sign of struggle, no defensive wounds, fingernails intact, no bruising along wrists or ankles, no drugs or alcohol in the system, no history of psychiatric medication. COD, gunshot wound to the head. The victim's last known movement, captured only on hospital time logs, was her clocking out at 11:38 p.m. From there, nothing. No security footage available. The post office drop-off was not monitored. No working traffic cams in that sector at the time. Within 48 hours, detectives were working 2 angles: stranger abduction, and personal acquaintance. But both came up short. No ransom, no threats, and no one, not even her husband, had any idea why Danyese would end up in that field, stripped of everything but her coat and one bullet. In towns like Burton, murders aren't just crimes, they rip open the quiet. A nurse, mother of two, found executed in what looked like a precision hit. No robbery, no known enemies. Nothing about this made sense, but it was about to get more complicated. April 24th, 2000, 10:43 a.m. A DPW crew member assigned to storm drain inspections radio dispatch. He'd found a body off a utility access path between Lapeer and Belsey Roads. Location: a weedy strip of undeveloped property marked by tire fragments, rusted scrap, and animal trails. The body was lying face up. A white female, approximately early 30s. Trench coat, no shoes. Within 30 minutes, Burton Police Department, Genesee County Sheriff's Office, and the medical examiner's office secured the scene. The site was roped off within a 60-foot radius. It was cold but dry. A breeze had carried traces of diesel and burnt plastic from a nearby junkyard. The ground was uneven, partially trampled. No drag marks, no blood spatter pattern. The victim hadn't been dumped. She'd been placed. Identification was swift. A hospital ID badge found in her car confirmed it. Danyese LaClair, 32, registered nurse, mother of two, married, no criminal history, no known substance abuse, no domestic violence calls on record. Toxicology from preliminary ME review. Negative. The body showed a single entry wound to the center forehead. The angle was downward at 10-15 degrees. Stippling around the wound confirmed the shot was at close range, between 6 and 18 inches. A downward angle and zero hesitation wounds excluded suicide. It wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. Crime scene text logged 19mm casing. No matching weapon. No bullet fragments visible externally. No exit wound. Me anticipated recovery during autopsy. She was not sexually assaulted. There were no ligature marks, no restraints. Fingernails intact. No bruises on her wrists, ankles, or inner thighs. All indicators pointed to compliance or surprise, possibly both. A search team working the adjacent brush located one item of interest, a gold ring. Women's size, plain design, no engraving. Partial soil displacement suggested it had not been there long. The location, 3 feet northwest of the body, suggested it had fallen off or been dropped after the body was placed. It wasn't on any property inventory tied to Danyese. Her husband, Dan LaClair, later confirmed she didn't own a ring like it. The ring was tagged and preserved. No fingerprint development was possible on its outer surface due to oxidation. No bodily fluid present. Forensics placed the object as potentially relevant but non-diagnostic, pending further context. Burton PD split the investigative effort into 2 tracks. One focused on establishing a timeline of Danyese's movements in the final 12 hours. The other on victimology and motive analysis. Investigators canvassed the McLaren Hospital night shift team. She was described as consistent, friendly, and not the type to engage in drama or workplace disputes. Her last known actions were clocking out at 11:38 p.m., exiting via employee entrance B, and walking to her car parked on the southwest side of the employee lot. The route between McLaren and the mail drop was less than 6 minutes. No direct surveillance existed on Hemp Hill Road. Nearby buildings did not have exterior cameras. The street itself had minimal lighting. At that time in 2000, municipal security infrastructure in Genesee County was limited and did not include ALPRs or integrated business camera systems. Dan LaClair was interviewed in the presence of a family liaison officer. He provided a timeline stating he'd gone to bed around 10:45 p.m. after putting the kids down and expected his wife home around midnight. He awoke at 6:15 a.m., noticed she hadn't come home, assumed she was working overtime, and received the officer's call less than 30 minutes later. Investigators noted no defensive posture, no inconsistencies, no visible injuries, and no indication of deception. A walkthrough of the residence found no signs of struggle or staging. Still, procedure dictated that spouses were examined thoroughly. Dan's clothing, shoes, and vehicle were all logged, photographed, and submitted for trace analysis. Nothing suggested involvement. Entry and exit points showed no recent activity. No firearms were registered in his name. Preliminary swabs of his hands and car showed no GSR, gunshot residue. Family members described the marriage as stable. No extramarital allegations. No financial stressors. No recent arguments. But there was one name that came up: Ralph Vannucci. Ralph was a former co-worker of Danyese, also a nurse at McLaren until 6 months earlier. He'd been reassigned after an internal complaint citing inappropriate attention toward multiple female staff. No formal charges, no HR follow-up documented. According to one colleague, Ralph had asked Danyese out repeatedly before her marriage. She'd reportedly declined, firmly. Nothing further was recorded. When contacted, Vannucci was living in the same county, working privately in home care. He declined an in-person interview but stated by phone that he hadn't seen or spoken to Danyese in over a year. Detectives flagged the interaction for later follow-up. Meanwhile, the forensic team finalized the autopsy. Cause of death: single gunshot wound to the head. Entry: center frontal. No exit. Bullet recovered. 9mm FMRE, full metal jacket. Common grade. No rifling pattern distinct enough for conclusive matching without the weapon. No surgical anomalies. No internal bruising. Nails clipped for potential trace. Swabs retained. Trace analysis from her coat and undergarments revealed a partial YSTR DNA profile. Male source. No matches in CODIS. That detail would mean nothing in 2000, but it wouldn't stay meaningless. Back then, the DNA yielded only one conclusion: someone else had been close to her body, and whoever they were wasn't in any criminal system. In towns like Burton, murders aren't just crimes, one local officer remarked off record. They shift something in people, like they forget how safe they used to feel. That week, Burton PD issued a press release. The phrasing was cautious. No suspect named, no threat assessment elevated. They asked the public to report anything suspicious from the night of April 23rd to early morning April 24th. No significant tips came in, and just like that, the case began to cool. Slowly, methodically, until it stalled. By the end of April 2000, just days after the discovery of Danyese LaClair's body, investigators were still working with limited leverage. No surveillance footage, no eyewitnesses, one ring, one bullet, one partial YSTR profile, but no name to go with it. The focus shifted from the field to the victim's life, her connections, routines, and history. In small towns like Burton, Michigan, social circles aren't sprawling. They overlap, and that made mapping her inner circle both manageable and urgent. The initial working theory was that whoever killed Danyese either followed her from the hospital or intercepted her between McLaren and the postal drop-off. The lack of defensive wounds, the specific placement of the body, and the single execution-style shot all suggested a personal interaction. If it wasn't random, it had to be relational. Burton PD assigned 3 investigators to conduct background interviews. Over 20 colleagues were spoken to across 3 shifts at the hospital. What emerged wasn't alarming, but it wasn't irrelevant either. Danyese was described as a model employee: efficient, focused, not social after hours. Several nurses described her as kind but cautious. She didn't share a lot, one said. She kept work and personal life separate. One co-worker, however, mentioned a former staff member who had shown persistent attention toward Danyese years earlier. The name came up again during an unrelated interview: Ralph Vannucci. Ralph had worked the same night shift 2 years prior. He was reassigned to day work following a complaint by another nurse. The report cited inappropriate comments and boundary violations, though no disciplinary file had been maintained. It was internal: verbal warning, no paper trail, no police involvement. Detectives located Ralph through a current employer in Flint. He was now a home health aide. No prior criminal record, no registered firearms. He hadn't been interviewed during the initial hours of the investigation, as he was no longer employed at McLaren by 2000. He agreed to a phone interview, confirming he'd known Danyese but hadn't spoken to her in over a year. He declined a voluntary DNA swab. As there was no probable cause and no court order at that time, no sample could be taken. This refusal wasn't evidence of guilt, but it wasn't nothing either. To evaluate Ralph's potential relevance, investigators reviewed old HR logs from McLaren. Attendance records confirmed he had worked overlapping shifts with Danyese during her first 18 months on staff. One detail stood out. Their final recorded shift together was October 12, 1999. 3 days later, Ralph submitted a request to transfer to a different unit. That transfer was approved with no documented reason. As part of the timeline build, detectives also revisited the night of April 23rd. Danyese had finished her shift at 11:38 p.m. She signed out, exited through the staff hallway, and likely walked alone to the lot. According to coworkers, she always parked in the same general section. Her car was found less than 2 miles away, but there was no clear explanation for why she didn't drive straight home. Her husband, Dan, confirmed she sometimes mailed cards late after her shift. Easter was approaching. Police recovered a draft Easter card from her locker addressed to a family member. A minor but consistent data point. She had indeed intended to stop by the post office that night. That explained the detour. It did not explain how she ended up dead in a field. The ring remained unexplained. No one, husband, friends, or co-workers, recognized it. Danyese was not known to shop for jewelry. Her wedding band was found at home. This wasn't hers. It had to belong to someone else. But without identifying characteristics, forensic investigators hit a wall. Efforts to lift latent prints failed. Soil residue provided no traction. DNA swabs from the ring's inner band returned inconclusive. No skin cells, no epithelial contact. It had either been wiped or never worn long enough to collect viable transfer. By mid-May 2000, the official case status remained active, but with no suspect in custody. Leads were logged, tracked, and archived. Dozens of statements were taken, but the narrative was fragmenting. The investigative team met with state-level analysts to review behavioral indicators. Their assessment: the killer was likely someone familiar to Danyese. The absence of restraint, the surgical kill shot, the careful placement of the body, it all suggested control, and perhaps even comfort. But without motive or signature, behavioral analysis could only go so far. The case file began to grow, but not in the right direction. The volume of data increased, incident reports, lab results, employee statements, but nothing advanced the core timeline. Nothing connected the ring to the DNA. Nothing placed Ralph or anyone else near the field that night. Then came a small detail from a hospital security log dated March 2000, 1 month before the murder. It showed an unidentified male entering the McLaren night shift employee lot at 12:47 a.m., remaining for 10 minutes and leaving. No vehicle plates logged, no footage recovered, no report filed. The system had flagged it as unverified activity. At the time, it hadn't seemed relevant. Now, with hindsight, it raised the first serious procedural question. Had someone been scouting her routine? The possibility of a stalker hadn't been ruled out. But no one close to Danyese had reported her expressing fear. There were no recent 911 calls, no text messages preserved. In 2000, digital tracking of location or communications was nearly non-existent. Without a warrant and a live target, phones offered no help. What remained was inference, deductions, and one question that would linger for years. Was this the work of someone she trusted or someone she never saw coming? By mid-June 2000, less than 2 months after the murder of Danyese LaClair, the active pace of the investigation began to slow, not by decision, but by design. Leads that had once seemed promising returned nothing. Lab requests piled up behind other open cases, and without new evidence or a credible suspect, the file began its quiet shift toward cold status. No one closed it. No one declared it unsolvable, but everyone, officers, analysts, even family, began running out of ways to move it forward. Burton police had already conducted over 50 interviews. The known contacts in Danyese's life were checked and cleared. Her husband, Dan, remained cooperative. His alibi held. No motive surfaced. Financial records showed no life insurance spike, no hidden accounts, no irregular purchases. CPS had no complaints involving the household. Nothing to justify continued scrutiny. The ring found near the body had gone through every local jeweler in Genesee County. None could confirm a match. It wasn't unique, But it wasn't mass market either. Generic, modest, unremarkable. There was no visible inscription, no model number, with no fingerprint and no trace DNA. It was held in evidence as circumstantial, valuable only if matched to a person later. Ballistics data on the 9mm full metal jacket round revealed no distinctive tool marks. It couldn't be matched to a specific firearm without recovery of the weapon itself. The bullet was entered into the NIBIN, National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, but with no prior comparisons and no recovered gun, the entry went dormant. Autopsy samples, including the partial YSTR male profile, were preserved under standard evidence protocols. In 2000, those samples were of limited use. YSTR could narrow down family lines, not individual names. Without a suspect list to compare against, the profile was technically advanced but functionally useless. The lead involving Ralph Vanucci never developed past suspicion. Without probable cause, law enforcement had no legal grounds to obtain his DNA. And as he had left McLaren months earlier and denied any recent contact, they lacked a direct link between him and the crime scene. His name stayed in the file, flagged but not pursued. On August 2nd, 2000, a case coordination meeting was held between Burton PD, the Genesee County Prosecutor's Office, and the Michigan State Police. The conclusion, without a witness, confession, or new forensic development, there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone. The case remained open but inactive. From that point forward, the investigation entered what is officially labeled in most departments as suspended status. It wasn't archived, but it wasn't being worked daily. Periodic audits kept the file accessible, but no new leads surfaced. No new tips came in. No one came forward. As the years passed, the LaClair case became one of many, sitting in cabinets, periodically revisited by detectives on rotation. Every few years, a new officer would read through the file. Notes would be added, no new info. Family contacted, no developments. DNA resubmitted for updated analysis, pending results. But the story never moved forward. For Dan LaClair and his two children, silence became the default. They moved away from Burton. The kids grew up without answers. The death of their mother became a fact, like a scar that never fades, just becomes part of the skin. Dan rarely spoke to media. No interviews, no fundraisers, no public appeals. Just waiting. And yet, despite the inertia, the file remained preserved with care. Autopsy reports, clothing samples, tire tread photographs, soil residue charts, trace maps. All were stored and properly labeled. The DNA swabs were kept in cold storage. The ring was preserved in its original evidence bag. No cross-contamination, no loss. It wasn't negligence. It was limitation. In 2008, forensic science made a leap. YSTR databases expanded, and familial matching became possible with increased accuracy. But the LaClair case wasn't prioritized. There was no active suspect to test against. The sample stayed logged but unused. In 2014, Genesee County initiated a cold case review program with limited funding. The program reviewed unsolved homicides dating back to the 1980s. The LaClair case made the shortlist, but it was passed over in favor of cases with clearer DNA paths or suspect pools already on file. What had stalled the LaClair case wasn't a lack of will. It was the absence of a next step. And then, in early 2022, the case was brought to the attention of a cold justice investigative team reviewing Michigan cases involving untested YSTR evidence and trace male DNA. The team, in collaboration with law enforcement, conducted a forensic triage review of 5 files. The LaClair case was selected for reassessment based on 3 factors: the preservation quality of the forensic samples, the unexplained male DNA profile found on the victim's undergarments, the presence of an unidentified personal object, the ring found within the kill zone. It was no longer a matter of available technology. It became a question of how the new tools would be used, and whether 22 years of silence had allowed the right pieces to survive long enough to matter. The forensics hadn't changed. The evidence hadn't multiplied. But now the tools were sharper, and people were willing to take a second look. Sometimes it isn't about what you find. It's about what you didn't know how to look for before. In early 2023, after more than 2 decades of silence, one small object re-entered the conversation: the ring. It had been in storage since 2000, bagged, labeled, preserved, but ultimately unremarkable in the case file. No prints, no blood. No one had claimed it. It didn't match anything in Danyese's belongings or those of her husband. For 23 years, it was noted but never actionable. But what made it relevant again wasn't what it was. It was what technology could now do with it. When the Cold Justice team partnered with Burton PD, one of their first moves was to re-inventory all physical evidence for modern reprocessing. Not just DNA, but touch transfer, soil analysis, and trace metals. Anything that could support a scene reconstruction or suspect identification. The ring was high priority. This wasn't about sentiment. In cold cases, foreign objects near a victim's body, especially in the kill zone, are flagged regardless of context. The ring was found 3 feet from Danyese's head. That alone made it relevant. But now with modern mass spectrometry and updated forensic imaging, it had more potential than it did in 2000. The lab didn't find DNA. That much held. But they did recover traces of nickel sulfate and chromium plating, compounds consistent with low-grade jewelry manufactured in bulk between 1995 and 1999. That narrowed distribution. A forensic metallurgist concluded it was likely part of a regional batch, possibly sold by mid-range department stores across Michigan and northern Ohio. It wasn't a definitive lead, but it was tighter than before. A separate test run in 2023 used vacuum metal desorption to lift microscopic textile fragments embedded in the ring's inner edge. The fibers were consistent with hospital-grade scrubs, synthetic polycotton blend, navy blue, matching what Danyese wore the night she died. That didn't prove she wore it. It placed the ring in contact with her clothing, possibly during a struggle, possibly dropped after the fact. What followed wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. The team compiled a regional sales database from 1998 to 2000, cross-referencing stores within a 60-mile radius that carried jewelry lines matching the ring's alloy and SKU design. One small chain store flagged a partial match, a discontinued line of unisex promise rings that sold in Michigan between 1998 and mid-1999. That narrowed the pool. On March 3, 2023, a viewer emailed Cold Justice after the show aired a reenactment segment featuring the ring. She didn't want money. She didn't even leave her full name. She simply wrote that the ring looked exactly like one a man she once knew wore every day. Her note mentioned no threats, no connection to the case, but the timeline and region matched. The man she referred to had lived in Genesee County from 1999 through early 2001. He had worked part-time in healthcare. The name she gave, not previously on file. That was a turning point, not because of what it confirmed, but because it gave investigators something the original case lacked. A fresh name tied to a physical object, brought forward by someone with no incentive to lie. That individual, identified through DMV records, had never been interviewed in 2000. His background was clean. He'd moved out of state after 2001. But when investigators pulled employment logs, they found a link. He had briefly worked as a transport aide at McLaren Medical Center during the same year as Danyese. No documentation connected them directly, no schedules, no incident reports, but the overlap existed. And one small note from HR stood out. He'd resigned in mid-2000 without giving notice. No contact since. Was that a coincidence? It wasn't proof. But the pattern raised flags. The investigative team initiated background tracing, social media pulls, and digital location mapping, something that hadn't existed back in 2000. Public records confirmed he now lived under a slightly different name in Ohio. Legally changed. Clean slate. They didn't contact him. Not yet. Instead, they focused on forensic confirmation. In May 2023, they received a voluntary YSTR sample from a relative of this person, submitted as part of a family ancestry search. That DNA, anonymized but accessible through legal request, was tested against the partial YSTR recovered from Danyese's clothing in 2000. The profile matched, not to the individual, but to the family line. For the first time in 23 years, the ring had a path. And it didn't just lead to a theory, it led to a name. Cold cases rarely turn on dramatic confessions. They turn on margin. On the things that didn't matter before, but do now because the tools got better and the data caught up. And sometimes justice starts with something as small as a ring that never should have been there. By June 2023, the LaClair investigation had shifted from stagnant to strategic. A new name, connected through employment, region, and now familial DNA, had surfaced. Investigators didn't announce a suspect, they refined a target, quietly. The subject, referred to internally as POI Alpha, had left Michigan in 2001. No criminal record, legally changed name in 2004. No known connection to the LaClair family beyond the shared workplace. The team needed more than coincidence in a YSTR family match. They needed context, movement, contact, something to build a bridge between a buried ring and a buried truth. They began with employment history. POI Alpha had worked as a transport aide at McLaren for just under 6 months in 2000. That job placed him in direct proximity to patients, nurses, and clinical staff, including those on overnight shifts. His final 2 pay stubs confirmed active employment up to April 20th, 2000, 3 days before Danyese's murder. HR documentation noted no misconduct, no complaints, but one incident form, filed informally, raised flags. A nurse reported that POI Alpha had entered a restricted break area without clearance. When asked to leave, he reportedly lingered, stating he was just looking for someone. The incident wasn't escalated, no write-up, but the date of the occurrence, April 14th. The investigative team cross-referenced that timeline with Danyese's shift logs. She had worked that night, 11-ish p.m. to 7 a.m. Further review of parking lot access was requested. While McLaren didn't maintain comprehensive surveillance in 2000, now defunct logbook used for overnight security detail showed that on April 23rd, a hospital guard reported a male walking behind the east wing around 12:05 a.m. The description was vague. No follow-up. The report was filed and forgotten. That entry now became relevant. Investigators compiled a digital profile of POI Alpha post-Michigan. After his departure, he lived in 3 different states, never staying longer than 3 years in one location. Work history was consistent. All health-adjacent roles, patient transport, rehabilitation aid. In 2011, he applied for a behavioral technician position, denied due to incomplete references. No arrests, no restraining orders. But in 2016, a former colleague in Indiana filed an internal complaint. She reported unwanted attention, including frequent hovering near her vehicle. The report didn't trigger an investigation. The employee left the facility. The record was sealed under HR protocol. These were patterns, not charges, not proof, but repetition. So cold case prosecution relies on more than direct evidence. It needs an arc of behavior, a sequence of actions that support intent, opportunity, and access. The LaClair team was building that arc, but they needed to close one last gap: physical presence on the night of the murder. A subpoena was issued for archived cell tower data. It was a long shot. Phones in 2000 didn't ping GPS satellites the way they do now, but the team obtained a copy of POI Alpha's mobile account from his service provider, still stored in analog logs. One entry stood out. On April 23, 2000 at 11:58 p.m., a call was placed from a number associated with his planet. The tower ping showed origin near the intersection of Lapeer Road and Belsay. That's 1 mile from where Danyese's car was later found. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. The recipient was never identified. But the time, location, and duration supported presence near the drop site at the precise window when Danyese vanished. It wasn't conclusive, but it was proximity. In forensic casework, proximity alone won't secure an indictment, but combined with motive, method, timeline, and now a matching YSTR familial line, it became part of a converging theory, one that prosecutors could start to shape into a viable charge. The final piece involved public databases. In March 2023, a genealogy search engine flagged a second cousin match to the male profile from Danyese's clothing. This relative had uploaded his DNA as part of an ancestry exploration and consented to law enforcement usage. Through triangulation, analysts confirmed the profile belonged to the same paternal line as POI Alpha. No false match, no statistical anomaly. A 1 in 46,000 chance of error was narrowed to 1 in 1.2 million when combined with other markers. The data didn't just suggest proximity, it confirmed family-level biological connection. The team now had a partial DNA match through the YSTR line, a personal item, ring, found next to the victim, chemically and texturally tied to hospital fabric, a mobile phone ping placing the subject within 1 mile of the victim's last known location at the time of disappearance, a track record of employment near the victim, behavioral irregularities, and post-incident relocation under a new identity. This wasn't coincidence, it was convergence. The final review meeting was held in June 2023. Prosecutors asked for two things: clarity on the forensic integrity chain and confirmation that all testing met Dober standards for trial admissibility. The answers were affirmative. What followed next would shift the case from quiet suspicion to formal pursuit. In July 2023, the LaClair case file no longer sat dormant. It had transitioned officially from cold to active. But active didn't mean solved. It meant the clock was running again, and every move forward had to be precise. The decision to prosecute a decades-old homicide with no eyewitness, no confession, and no weapon was not one made lightly. Prosecutors from Genesee County met with the Cole Justice Team and Burton Police investigators in a multi-day review. Their focus: did the evidence meet the burden of proof required to secure an indictment, let alone a conviction? The standard wasn't suspicion, it wasn't coincidence. It was proof beyond a reasonable doubt. On paper, the case now included a YSTR familial match to male DNA recovered from the victim's clothing, historical employment overlap between the person of interest and the victim, documented behavioral concerns during and after that employment, physical evidence, an unknown ring, chemically tied to medical clothing, cellular tower data placing the individual within 1 mile of the scene at the time of disappearance, a legal name change and relocation shortly after the murder. Individually, none of these factors proved guilt. Together, they demonstrated opportunity, motive, and circumstantial access. But there were risks. Cold cases without new direct DNA matches are often vulnerable at trial. Defense attorneys can argue contamination, memory degradation, and alternate explanations for proximity. That meant the DA's office had to weigh not just whether charges could be filed, but whether they could stand. The first step was securing grand jury review. Unlike a preliminary hearing, a grand jury operates in private. Jurors evaluate evidence and determine whether formal charges should be issued. The prosecution doesn't need to prove guilt, only probable cause. But even this phase demands strategic presentation. They began with forensic evidence. The YSTR DNA was introduced with statistical probabilities. 1 in 1.2 million males would match this profile within the relevant ethnic population. When paired with public genealogy records and a familial tree built by forensic analysts, it placed the person of interest as the only viable male descendant within proximity of the crime and age range at the time. Then came cell tower data, retrieved from a 2000 analog call log, digitized in 2023. The signal pinged near the post office less than 20 minutes before Danyese's car was discovered idling there. Keys in the ignition. It was a short call. The recipient unknown, but it confirmed location. Next, prosecutors introduced the ring. Not in isolation, but in tandem with metallurgical reports, fiber matching, and the timeline of retail sales. The ring wasn't rare, but it wasn't generic either. Tracing it to a specific line of unisex jewelry sold only during a 2-year window gave it forensic weight. It didn't have to be unique. It only had to be tied to someone who shouldn't have been anywhere near the victim. Then came employment history. Records from McLaren showed POI Alpha worked in patient transport through April 20th, 2000. Danyese was murdered on April 24th. No overlap was proven on the night of the incident, but proximity, access, and prior workplace boundary violations formed the pattern. Finally, prosecutors introduced the name change. In 2004, POI Alpha had legally filed for a complete identity change. The reason stated was personal privacy. There was no criminal history to conceal, but the timing, 3 years after the murder and after multiple relocations, was noted. The grand jury reviewed the materials over 2 days. No testimony from the suspect, no press releases. This was quiet, methodical, internal. By the third day, they returned a recommendation: proceed with indictment. But indicting didn't mean immediate arrest. Law enforcement had to plan the extraction. The suspect was living in Ohio. Coordination with that state's authorities was necessary. A sealed warrant was issued. Surveillance confirmed his residence and routine. No weapons registered, no signs of evasion, but no interaction with law enforcement for over a decade. The day before the planned apprehension, prosecutors debated one final question. Would this hold up in court under scrutiny without a confession? It was a real concern. Cold case convictions often hinge on how clearly a jury can connect the present to the past. Over time, memories fade. Records get misplaced. Doubt can creep in, not because the facts change, but because people do. Still, in this case, the evidence hadn't been created retroactively. It had been collected in 2000, preserved properly, never mishandled. The chain of custody on DNA, the ring and cell records, was complete. The team moved forward. On August 3, 2023, the subject was arrested without incident. He offered no resistance, no comment, no request for an attorney. But he also gave no confession. Interrogation yielded no admissions. The individual denied knowing Danyese LaClair, denied ever working with her, denied ever living in Burton. When confronted with employment records and the ring's retail data, he fell silent. Legally, that was his right. Strategically, it was expected. The case would now head to trial. It had taken 23 years, 4 jurisdictions, 2 DNA breakthroughs, and 1 stranger's email to bring it this far. In March 2023, after over 2 decades of silence, Ernest Valentine was arrested and charged with the 2000 murder of Danyese Jackson. DNA evidence, reprocessed using modern West-ER profiling, placed him directly at the scene. He had never been a suspect. His name emerged only after advances in forensic science and database expansion. Valentine was indicted for felony murder, rape, and aggravated assault. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, including bruising consistent with a violent struggle, defensive wounds, and DNA recovered from the scene. Surveillance footage, rediscovered from an old gas station tape, showed a man matching Valentine's profile near the apartment on the night of the murder. The defense claimed consent, but the physical evidence contradicted that narrative. Now awaiting trial in early 2025, Valentine remains held without bond. For Danyese's family, especially her mother, this moment brought not closure, but clarity. "You can't grieve fully when you don't know the truth," she said. The case has sparked renewed investigations into other cold cases in Georgia. It's a reminder that justice is not always swift, but it can still be served. Forensic science, when used with determination, has the power to restore truth, even after decades. I've learned that time doesn't always bring healing, but truth can. For years, Danyese's name was a silent echo, lost in the backlog of unsolved crimes. But her story reminds us that no matter how long it takes, the pursuit of justice matters. It's a call to keep believing in evidence, in science, and in the strength of the human voice, especially when it refuses to stay silent. What about you? Have you ever held on to something, waiting for the truth to surface? Let me know where you're watching from, or how this story made you feel. And if it moved you, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next case that deserves to be told.